I can't just abandon my parents when they look so sad. That's why I've decided they should live here with us. This is also a perfect opportunity for you to rebuild trust with them. I couldn't ignore what Brian had just said, even though I had been listening to him absent-mindedly. Did Brian really say he wants them to live here? I usually ignore his complaints, but the idea of his parents moving in with us was something I couldn't stand. Wait a minute, did you say you're inviting them here? I asked Brian, slightly frightened. Brian nodded firmly immediately. Yes, that's right. They are almost broken-hearted because of you. What will you do if something happens? Brian's thoughts were becoming increasingly incomprehensible, but it was clear he had no intention of listening to my opinion. Do you understand how anxious elderly parents can feel? I'm leaving all the moving preparations to you. Ryan's decision to live together was repeated over and over in my head, weighing heavily on my heart. However, at that moment, something Brian said struck a chord with me. Maybe seeing me suddenly cheerful, Brian looked puzzled. I had been unable to deal with it before, but finally I felt relieved. This should not end this way. After sending off my in-laws with a smile, I started to put my plan into action. Weeks had passed since Brian decided to move in together. Is my parents' moving in completed? We both had work that day and had left them to move into a company. Yes, my parents have also finished moving in now. Brian seemed unable to grasp what I had just said despite my optimistic tone. After a moment of silence, Brian spoke again. What? My name is Rachel Simpson, a 47-year-old city employee. After marrying Brian, whom I met through a part-time job during my student days, we are now living together. We had decided not to have children before marriage and do not have any. Instead, I pour my passion into my work, where I am now a manager. Although Brian is in sales, he seems dissatisfied that his income is lower than mine. The house we currently live in is actually my property. Brian did not seem very attached to having a home. I decided to buy a home about a year ago to fully enjoy my hobbies, gardening and cooking. Initially concerned about what people would think, Brian now has no complaints, perhaps because he accepted my suggestion to pretend it was him who bought it. Now he proudly talks about it, as if he built the house himself, and even invites colleagues and subordinates over on weekends to boast about his achievements. This boasting done without my permission is truly infuriating. If I try to say anything, he snaps back. What do you know? You're just a woman. He also boasts to my in-laws that he built the house, hiding the fact that I did it. Despite being married for a long time, I feel Brian's recent behavior is particularly terrible. I can no longer feel his love. Moreover, the relationship with my in-laws is causing me further distress. My in-laws have always been known for being meddlesome, and our relationship was never good. Although I had given up on getting along with my mother-in-law, being interfered with from afar was troublesome. When deciding to marry Brian, we discussed not having children, and my in-laws agreed. However, they often bring this up and blame me. When will you show us our grandchildren, Rachel? You're really no good, my mother-in-law approaches me. Despite knowing it's difficult to have children at my age, she continues to blame me. It's clear she brings this up just to criticize me, even though this was a decision we made together. Brian acts as if it has nothing to do with him, not reacting to my mother-in-law's words. Feeling constantly criticized, visiting my in-laws has become a source of distress. However, maybe because Brian is an only child and hasn't fully detached from his parents, they often visit our home on weekends. I have no time to rest due to the visits from my in-laws and guests invited by Brian. Sometimes I wonder if we had children, but regretting now doesn't change anything. Currently, Brian prioritizes himself and his parents over me. Though he used to be a wonderful boyfriend and husband, Brian, who is not fully detached from his parents, used to protect me from his mother's harsh words. Maybe he changed after starting to feel conscious of our income difference. I have no interest in such matters and don't remember ever complaining to Brian. Once married, I believe the one with the higher income should support the family, and one's value shouldn't be judged by their income. I thought Brian understood my perspective, but it seems that was not the case. Over time, our relationship gradually changed. Honestly, we could live decently on Brian's income alone. He has suggested several times that I become a stay-at-home wife, but I rejected the proposal. This is because I want to be able to live independently when necessary and have the freedom to spend on hobbies in my home. Knowing that Brian cared about this made me feel guilty initially. However, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm also frustrated with being criticized just for societal appearances or pride. Once, Brian scolded me harshly for this reason. I retorted, "Don't always complain about such trivial matters." It seems Brian couldn't accept that, and his treatment of me has become increasingly harsh. Moreover, he repeatedly criticized me in front of his parents, emphasizing how unsuitable I am as a wife. Seeing this as a good opportunity, my mother-in-law began to indulge Brian excessively, intensifying her attacks on me. Brian's opinions were always supported, and I was cast as the villain. Since then, they have frequently criticized me, and with no one around to seek support, over 20 years have passed. This house, where Brian freely invites guests, was a great comfort to me. Eventually, I thought my in-laws and Brian's friends would stop visiting. Then, enduring Brian's complaints would allow me to fully enjoy my interests. I've endured these tough days with such hopes. However, an incident occurred that seemed to nullify all that. It happened on a certain holiday. Ryan was out that day, and as usual, my in-laws dropped by my house without prior notice. Since they visit unannounced, I can't freely go out. If I left while they were here, I can imagine what they would say. I had planned to buy gardening supplies, but regrettably, I had to cancel it. Rachel, I haven't been feeling well since yesterday. I'd like to have some soup for lunch, the seemingly healthy mother-in-law demanded as if it were her right. But I couldn't prepare the soup immediately. "I'm sorry, but we don't have any ingredients," I said as I braced myself to go shopping. My mother-in-law immediately became angry. "You should have known we were coming. You should have prepared something at least. Are you trying to feed an old woman like me something greasy?" When she starts, my mother-in-law's complaints don't stop. Beside her, my father-in-law chimes in, "That's right, that's right. Even if you say that, I'll go buy it now, so please wait a little longer." With a desire to escape, I decided to go shopping reluctantly. As I prepared to leave, my mother-in-law continuously expressed her dissatisfaction. "How can you leave an old person at home like this? Unbelievable." With their voices behind me, I left the house. Why do I have to leave my own home, which should be a place of solace, as if I'm fleeing? On my way shopping, my mind was filled with a mix of emotions. When I hurried back home after shopping, my in-laws were no longer there, leaving me puzzled. Maybe they had some urgent matters to attend to. Coming home to find no one there after being sent out for shopping was frustrating, but I was slightly glad not to face them. I quickly prepared the soup and, after eating, enjoyed some rare alone time. "Rachel, what are you doing?" When Brian returned in the evening, he lashed out at me in anger. I couldn't immediately understand why Brian was so upset, and I just stood there stunned. "I heard from Mom you left them alone to go shopping. They're elderly. What if something had happened to them in a place that's not their home?" Apparently, my mother-in-law had told Brian about the day's events. One would realize the absurdity of the accusation upon calming down, but it seemed Brian felt his parents were slighted. Considering my mother-in-law's personality, she likely exaggerated the story to Brian, making a big fuss. Brian's anger only grew, not subsiding at all. "This isn't just about this one time. You always treat my parents poorly, disrespectfully. Aren't they your family too? Don't you think they deserve some respect?" As I remained silent, Brian continued to berate me. If I were at fault, his scolding wouldn't hurt as much. But there was no basis in Brian's claims. Not even understanding why I was being scolded, I just watched Brian get emotional. In such moments, I wondered where was the man I fell in love with. I can't just abandon my parents when they look so sad. That's why I've decided they should live here with us. This is also a perfect opportunity for you to rebuild trust with them. I couldn't ignore what Brian had just said. Even though I had been listening to him absent-mindedly, did Brian really say he wants them to live here? I usually ignore his complaints, but the idea of his parents moving in with us was something I couldn't stand. "Wait a minute, did you say you're inviting them here?" I asked Brian, slightly frightened. Brian nodded firmly and immediately. "Yes, that's right. They are almost broken-hearted because of you. What will you do if something happens?" Brian's thoughts were becoming increasingly incomprehensible, but it was clear he had no intention of listening to my opinion. "Do you understand how anxious elderly parents can feel? I'm leaving all the moving preparations to you." After declaring that, Brian disappeared into the room while contacting his mother. Though I couldn't agree with the moving plan, opposing it might create a rift between Brian and me. I've had doubts about our relationship, but part of me still wanted this life with him. For now, I had no choice but to start arranging the move according to Brian's decision, convincing myself. I began to work on the moving plans the next day. Coincidentally, Brian was off, and my mother-in-law visited. Contrary to the weak behavior Brian mentioned, my mother-in-law was more assertive than ever, starting around the house as if it were hers. "Rachel's room will be ours to use from now on. You're usually busy with work, so you won't need it," she began, turning my house with my father-in-law and Brian. Then they started listing demands. "Put a chest of drawers here," or "this desk color doesn't match the room." "Rachel, are you recording this?" I don't want to repeat myself. She carefully checked if I was noting everything down, even overseeing the details. "I heard about the cohabitation from Brian yesterday." With no direct word from my in-laws yet, they were already making arrangements as if it were a given. Witnessing this scenario, I felt my heart sinking deeply. Will I really live with my in-laws from now on? Do I have to keep catering to their demands indefinitely? Just the thought enveloped my heart in darkness. When my in-laws' inspection finally subsided, the notepad in my hands was filled with their requests. As I blankly stared at the notepad, my mother-in-law, unconcerned, continued speaking. "Rachel, let me know as soon as you've scheduled the moving day. You'll arrange the movers, won't you? I would ultimately be responsible for the moving expenses." The lack of hope for the future made me want to give up thinking altogether. Ryan's decision to live together was repeated over and over in my head, weighing heavily on my heart. However, at that moment, something Brian said struck a chord with me. "Maybe seeing me?" Suddenly cheerful, Brian looked puzzled. I had been unable to deal with it before, but finally I felt relieved. This should not end this way. After sending off my in-laws with a smile, I started to put my plan into action. Weeks had passed since Brian decided to move in together. Are my parents moving in? We both had work that day and had left them moving into the company. Yes, my parents have also finished moving in. Now Brian seemed unable to grasp what I had just said, despite my optimistic tone. After a moment of silence, Brian spoke again. "What?" Ignoring what Brian was about to say, I ended the call. Even after hanging up, Brian's calls were relentless. He must have been filled with anxiety about what was happening. I doubted he would leave work halfway to come home, so he must have remained worried for a while. Considering the troubles I faced, this situation felt somewhat satisfying. But more than Brian's reaction, I was concerned about how my in-laws would behave. Unaware of what awaited, my in-laws must have been shocked by the scene at our house, since my parents were also there. Let's rewind a bit. On the day I was informed about the cohabitation with Brian's parents, I began to devise a plan for revenge. Both Brian and his mother had often said it's not right to leave elderly people alone at home. Originally, my in-laws were living together, making their claim nonsensical. But I decided to use their words to my advantage. That is, to ensure elderly people aren't left alone, I would move my parents into our house as well. This plan might seem absurd, but then what Brian and his mother were saying was already unreasonable. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, as they say. I intended to return exactly the treatment I had experienced to the three of them from the beginning. My family and Brian's didn't get along well. Unlike me, my parents are outspoken and assertive. There were a few meetings early in our marriage, but my family's strong opinions clearly overwhelmed Brian's parents. Why hadn't I discussed the problems with Brian and his family before? It was a simple wish to maintain my relationship with Brian. I wanted to avoid causing any trouble as much as possible. However, that wish faded when the three of them started to pressure me intensely. When I contacted my mother, she responded immediately. I told her everything about my experiences with Brian and his parents without holding back. The constant sarcasm from my mother-in-law about our child-free choice, Brian's reaction to my income exceeding his, and the cohabitation plan that was decided without my consent. Initially, my mother just listened silently, but gradually her anger became evident in her voice, and my father, listening beside her, also raised his voice. They were angrier on my behalf than I had anticipated. Finally, over the phone, my mother said, "You've been struggling on your own, haven't you?" and started crying. I immediately shared the plan I had just conceived, and my parents quickly agreed to help. My daughter has been wronged by these people, and they will pay for what they've done, my father said determinedly. Contemplating how to exact revenge on the three of them, I was overwhelmed by his fervor. But their support was comforting. Given that I had been dealing with these issues alone without confiding in anyone, they empathized with my feelings and shared my outrage. We calmed down and began to plan the move together. When I returned home in the evening on moving day, Brian was there, trembling as he greeted me. Behind him, my father appeared, beaming with pride. "Rachel, it's been a while." "You've built a splendid house," he said, pushing past Brian to stand at the entrance. Brian cowered in a corner of the entrance at the sight of my father. "It's truly a lovely home," my mother added shortly after. They had already taken action against the three, proudly reporting their maneuvers to me. The scene was so ludicrous that I couldn't help but laugh with strong allies by my side. I felt my anxieties and doubts gradually dissipating as we entered the living room. The four were seated around the table while my parents chatted cheerily. Brian and his parents were as silent as if at a funeral. It was unusual to see my usually outspoken mother-in-law so quiet, which seemed strange to me. At the same time, I was struck anew by my parents' presence and strength. I heard that this move was Brian's idea, my mother exaggeratedly commented to my father. Father nodded deeply in the conversation, making his stance clear. However, it seems Rachel's opinions and position haven't been considered in this family meeting, even though she is the one who built this house with her efforts. My father's calm yet pointed critique intensified the already tense atmosphere, turning it into an icy chill. Rian, receiving my father's stern gaze, was visibly shaken and desperately looked to his parents, my in-laws, for help. Nonetheless, there's the fact that Brian has supported and helped Rachel in many ways, hasn't he? My mother-in-law attempted to soften the mood with her words in this harsh environment. However, her words did not resonate with my mother, who did not miss the underlying intent and responded with deeper probing. Are you suggesting Rachel has been dishonest in some way? As far as I know, she has been shouldering the financial responsibilities of this house and even the moving expenses for you, she challenged, her provocative words directed at everyone in the room. At my mother's forceful statement, Brian and his parents could only remain silent, unable to rebut. Brian, stop spreading unnecessary falsehoods and causing your parents worry. I built this house. You should convey the truth. I firmly retorted, asserting my position. Usually quick to argue, Brian remained silent this time. He hung his head, muttering to himself. Even witnessing Brian's perplexed state, his parents offered no assistance, fearful of being reproached themselves. The trio, who usually united to criticize me, seemed to be seeking self-preservation this time. Well, we're tired from the move today, so let's discuss this in detail another time. We'll go rest now, my father said to my mother, and the three of them exchanged relieved glances. Their reaction was so issy that I would have burst into laughter if it were appropriate. The room my mother-in-law had designated for me was now firmly in my parents' hands. They moved to their room contentedly, giving me a smile before closing the door. The three left behind continued to sit in silence as before. I expected them to raise their voices in anger at me, but there was no sign of that. It seems my parents had effectively disarmed them. They likely had been treated haughtily even before I arrived, I thought to myself. The trio showed no intent to criticize me, merely observing me silently until I returned to my room. My in-laws, who had planned to live in this house permanently, had already started the process of relinquishing their own home. With no way to turn back and no place to retreat, they were stuck. Ryan, too, must have never anticipated living with my parents. Now overwhelmed with uncertainty about the future, just as I had been. Watching the three of them, I finally felt relieved and fell asleep with a deep sense of peace. From the next day, everything started to revolve around what my parents decided, just as it used to be under my mother-in-law's role. When we say we want hamburgers for lunch, my mother stated, and Brian hurried to prepare the car. If you're at home and not working, you should take care of the household chores for the two of us who are out working, my father declared, prompting my mother-in-law to quickly start cleaning and preparing the food. The once domineering in-laws seemed to lose their vigor gradually. They appeared to have run out of words of criticism against me. Rachel, I have something to discuss with you. Is that okay? In the situation where my parents were staying in our house, Brian started the conversation cautiously. Noticing that Brian wanted to talk, I decided to listen to what he had to say. We had interactions every day since our family started living together, but this was the first time we were having a serious conversation alone. In Brian's room, he started speaking with a serious look. Rachel, I'm sorry. My mother, father, and we all deeply regret our actions. Please, could you ask your parents to return to their original home? As expected, Brian was asking for my parents to leave this house. Even with Brian asking, I couldn't accept his request. Does that mean your parents will also leave this house? I asked. Brian frowned. My parents have already let go of their house. You know that, he responded. It seemed Brian's thought process hadn't changed at all. He was still only considering his and his parents' benefits. So, you're saying that only my parents should leave this house? Is that what you mean? I threw the sharp question at him. It was their own responsibility to have sold their house without consulting me. The fact that they have nowhere to go is not my concern, he replied. Do you remember you were the one who suggested this, and now you're saying leave this house? How can you say such a thing to my parents? I pressed on. Ryan showed anger, but quickly suppressed his emotions. It was clear that arguing here would only worsen their situation. This is my house. If you and your parents can't accept the decisions made by me and my parents, you are free to leave. I stated curtly and left his room. In the living room, his parents were anxiously waiting, but I ignored them and returned to my room. Soon after, I could hear my mother-in-law crying from the living room. She was disappointed that I did not accept Brian's request. However, I had never told my in-laws to leave this house in the first place. The situation with my parents in control must have been unbearable for them. If they opposed me, they would be pressured by my parents, making their stay here miserable. Eventually, my in-laws decided to leave the house on their own. Following that, I told Brian we were separating and demanded compensation for the emotional distress caused. Brian agreed, and our divorce was finalized. Without a home to return to, my in-laws and Brian found themselves in a similar predicament, starting a new life in a small apartment. The elderly in-laws, forced back into a cramped apartment, faced the reality of losing their former home. On the day they left, my father finally let his emotions erupt, admonishing them harshly. "You who tormented my precious daughter will face retribution. She is not a tool for you to use. Never show yourselves in front of us again," he declared. With my father's words behind them, the three left our home, freed from years of bondage. Tears streamed down my face, surrounded by my supportive parents. I felt warm. A few days after Brian and my in-laws departed, my parents suddenly announced they would be returning home next week. I was shaken by this unexpected news. I had been welcoming the idea of them staying on. However, when I proposed they continue living with me, both my parents kindly refused. We fear becoming like them if we stay, but remember, you can always come to us. Call us any time you're in trouble, they said. Having witnessed the actions of Brian's in-laws up close, they felt we might unintentionally invite similar misfortune upon ourselves. I came to terms with my in-laws' behavior, especially my mother-in-law, who became increasingly arrogant and ultimately brought about her own unhappy end. While Brian is partly to blame, it's undeniable that my in-laws were the ones who led him to his misfortune. Thinking about this made it difficult for me to stop my parents, so I decided to respect their decision. They were firm in their resolve and true to their word. They returned to their home a few days later. The parents were in and out so quickly, leaving me no time to express my gratitude for their help. I deeply appreciate that my parents came all the way to support me, even if there was a semblance of pretense in their actions. The moving effort was significant for my elderly parents, and I cannot fully express my deep gratitude for their support. I hope to invite them over to my home again in the future to show my heartfelt appreciation. When peaceful times return regarding Brian, his past actions have become the talk of his workplace, impacting his reputation. Additionally, it became known that the house he claimed to have built was actually mine, which has made him the subject of ridicule among his colleagues. The compensation he had to pay after our divorce was substantial, placing a significant financial burden on him. He is now living in a low-cost apartment, relying on his and his parents' savings. Ryan and his in-laws have lost everything in a way they never anticipated. This series of events has made me acutely aware of how unpredictable life can be and how minor incidents can lead to significant changes. Post-divorce, I've immersed myself in my hobbies, enriching my daily life and enjoying the freedom I've regained. I'm savoring this new chapter, cherishing the support of my parents more than ever. With Brian's constant nagging gone, I've reignited my passion for gardening, leading to an unexpected and delightful encounter. Despite my skepticism about forming deep connections, I've grown closer to someone through our shared interest. We both have experienced divorce and overcome life's challenges, which has cautiously but steadily deepened our bond. This gentle pace seems right for both of us. I've kept my distant parents updated and shared about this new person in my life. While they wish me happiness, they also show their concern, which I can sense. Feeling guilty for causing them worry, I've chosen to be transparent with them this time. In this way, a fresh breeze has begun to blow through my life. I'm unleashing my suppressed self-expression, looking forward to living authentically, and I hope to continue cherishing the deep gratitude I feel for my parents, who have always supported me.